Good morning, afternoon, or evening, or whatever time it is for you guys today, and welcome back to today's video. So today, we are going to be talking about depth of processing. So one of the things I want to mention here is we're pulling information from two different chapters when we talk about depth of processing. So the first chapter that we're going to be pulling from is to finish out chapter number 8. So we're going to be talking about the information processing model, we'll talk about memory, we'll talk about attention, etc. So we're pulling that information in, but we are also going to be pulling from chapter number 4. So thinking about the different thinking styles, different learning styles, etc. So it's kind of a combination of the two of them together here. So let's go ahead and talk about our objectives for today. So today's objectives are to understand the depth of knowledge and to understand different types of learning styles, both their strengths as well as their limitations. So before we get into learning anything new, I also want to review Bloom's taxonomy. And the reason why we're going to do a brief review here is because we're going to compare and contrast it to Webb's depth of knowledge. So with that said, let's review Bloom's taxonomy, and then we're going to go into Webb's depth of knowledge, or DOK for short. So Benjamin Bloom created the taxonomy to help us describe and classify observable knowledge, skills, attitudes, behaviors, and abilities. And he really thought that this was based upon the idea that the levels of observable actions would indicate that something is happening in the brain. So the more complex the cognitive activity would be, the higher it is in his taxonomy. So one of the key things to keep in mind when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy is thinking about certain keywords or key verbs that are going to demonstrate critical thinking abilities. So when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, we always start at the bottom. Again, this is a refresher, not necessarily going into very much depth about what each one of these are. But one of the things I want to remind ourselves about is this idea of critical thinking. So when we talk about critical thinking is the process of analyzing information to make a judgment or a decision. So when we're thinking about what questions are involved in tests, what questions are involved in assessments, or anything like that, we are really thinking about where does it fall on this taxonomy or on the depth of knowledge, etc. So let's talk about those key terms or key verbs that are associated with each of these different levels. Again, remember, we always start at the bottom and we work towards the top. So at the very basic level, we have remember. And remember is just recalling the facts and basic concepts. So some of the key verbs that are going to demonstrate critical thinking, and you might see when we talk about like a remember question on an exam, would be list, name, recall, record, relate, repeat, state, tell, or even underline, right? So this is just recalling facts, basic concepts, identifying information. Just the very basics, right? On the next hand, we have understand. So understand is going to be where we explain ideas and concepts. So this is where we're going to classify, describe, discuss, explain, identify. So not just underline something, but like identifying a passage where you have to go in, etc. Excuse me, I have to pick up my fan real quick. This could even be where we recognize some information as well, or even restate it. The next level we have is apply or application. So this is where we are going to use information in these situations. One of the topics we'll come back to later on in this semester is this idea of transfer. So transferring information from one situation to another situation. There's multiple types of transfer. We're not going to get into it in this video, but I promise we'll get to it a little later on in this class. So when we talk about apply, this is where we're going to complete or demonstrate or incorporate or operate or practice or sketch, illustrate a concept. Next, we're going to have analyze. So this is where we're going to draw connections among ideas. So this is where we would compare and contrast. This is where we are going to differentiate or distinguish between one concept and another concept. This is where we're going to experiment. This is where we are going to debate is going to be evaluate. This is where we're going to appraise or categorize a concept there. So this is analyze. The next one, again, we're working our way up. The next one is going to be evaluate. When we talk about evaluate, this is where we debate. So we're going to justify a stand or a decision that we've made. So when we are justifying, we have to do an appraisal. We have to argue. We have to defend. We're going to have to make a judgment. Are we for or against this stance? We need to either select it or support that particular value or even give a critique for that particular concept. The last and final level, I lost train of thought for a second. The last and final level is create. And when we talk about create, this is really about producing a new or original work. And so this is where you would design, assemble, construct. This is where you would develop or formulate or even investigate a topic. One of the biggest things when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy in terms of education is that we really see that this Bloom's taxonomy grows, expands, if you will, becomes broader as we move through our educational system. So let me give you an example here, okay? So when we talk about kindergarten or pre-K, a lot of times we're just trying to get them to understand basic concepts, right? Getting them to recall simple facts, simple concepts. We might ask them to memorize how to write a letter, how to count, how to differentiate between a dog and a cat, right? So this is where we are having very low levels of the Bloom's taxonomy. So in this case, the remember. Now, one of the things that I do want to mention here is a lot of the times they might be working in a couple of these statements or a couple of these areas. But keep in mind that as we move high on our education, so let's say we get to middle school. In middle school, we're starting to apply. We're starting to analyze, make connections between concepts. Can we do that at a younger age? Absolutely. Is it more simplistic? Yes, it is. When we say get to high school, even college, right? We are going to expect them to demonstrate a lot more advanced knowledge. So we're asking them to evaluate, participate in debates. We're asking them to create a portfolio. We're asking them to do a lot more, right? So as we think about this Bloom's taxonomy, you can really think of it as pre-K, kindergarten, working its way up. Again, one of the things I want to be clear about here is we can still have certain topics at a lower level, but some of them are not going to be where it's going to be strictly, oh, this is going to only happen in high school. So for example, one of the examples I gave in class was the idea of science class, more specifically like a science lab. So maybe you went outside and you were looking at the different leaves, or you went outside, or you were in the laboratory and you made a volcano explode, or you dissected a frog or a cat or a pig or anything like that in biology lab, right? All of that could be considered a replication. You might be thinking to yourself, well, wouldn't that be creating something because you're producing something new or original work? The thing about science experiments in particular is that it's very formulaic. What I mean by that is the idea that we should come to the same conclusion no matter if I'm in a 9 o'clock class, a 10 o'clock class, an 11 o'clock class. It should be consistent across the time. So when we talk about those science experiments, specifically when we think of like middle school, even high school, they're more of a replication rather than a creation of an event, etc. Could those definitely be things where you create a project for? Absolutely. So let's say in high school you're in an art or music class, and one of the things you have to do is you have to create a new, um, I'm thinking of band for right this second, but say you're in band, you have to create a new sequence for a song for the halftime show, or you are in art class, so you need to make a pottery because you're in pottery class or something like that, right? So there's definitely ways that you can create at a lower level. It just may not be as advanced as, say, when you're in high school or even if you're in college. So I wanted to review that because we're going to compare and contrast that to Webb's depth of knowledge, or DOK for short. So when we talk about Webb's depth of knowledge, one of the first things off the bat that you need to look at is Webb's depth of knowledge is only 4, Bloom's taxonomy is 6. So when we compare, we're going to have to combine a couple of these segments together. I also want to be clear, most of the time, Webb's depth of knowledge is also not presented in a triangle. However, because we are comparing and contrasting a triangle, I wanted to compare depth of knowledge visualized as a triangle to the triangle for Bloom's taxonomy. So with that said, let's talk about the lowest level. So in Webb's depth of knowledge, the lowest level is recall and reproduction. So when we talk about some of the key terms for recall and reproduction, we can see that can a student recall a simple fact from a story requires shallow understanding and no analysis. When we talk about recall and reproduction, what is this similar to? More specifically, what is this similar to for Bloom's taxonomy? Hopefully, you picked remember. Now, technically, I would say this goes a little bit beyond just remember. It could also include a little bit of understand here. So I always like to think of the depth DOK as the first level is equivalent to Bloom's taxonomy, remember and understand. All right, next is going to be skills and concepts. So some of the key verbs that we might see for skills and concepts are going to be, can the student think beyond recalling a fact? Students may be able to interpret, infer, classify, categorize, organize, compare and contrast, determine whether a fact or opinion, predict, determine cause and effect, apply, reconstruct, and resequence a story, right? So you'll notice here that this is going to be similar to what concepts in Bloom's taxonomy? Hopefully what we saw here is that it says interpret, it says apply, it says compare and contrast. So let's go back to Bloom's taxonomy. So when we're talking about compare and contrasting, this is going to be analyze. See here what it says compare and contrast. But then it also clearly also states apply. So I like to think of this level of skills and concepts as the apply and analyze stage. All right, let's talk about strategic thinking. So when we talk about strategic thinking, some of the key things that a student can do in this case would be thinking beyond the text of his word or another text for an answer, or adapt the text to create something new. Can he explain? Can he generalize? Can he connect dots from one text to another? Can he evaluate or formulate opinions and then explain them? So in this case, it's not creating something brand new, but it's adopting the text or think beyond just his own word, beyond the text for the answer. So what do you think strategic thinking is associated with when we talk about Bloom's taxonomy? If you said evaluate, you would be correct here. So evaluate would be where we're arguing, we're appraising, we're debating, we're providing support, right? So this is justify a stand or decision. The last and final one is probably not a surprise. It's going to be extended thinking. And extended thinking, we only have one left, is going to be related to create. So when we talk about extended thinking is where students take information from multiple sources and are able to apply this information to a new task that requires complex thinking, usually over time. The key here is that it creates a new task. So it's not just about adopting something. It's not about explaining or generalizing or connecting the dots from one text to another. It's really just going to focus on creating a new task or a new product. That is what we're thinking of when we talk about create. So producing new or original work. The other thing that I want to be very clear about here is when we talk about create, we also have to have the skills to be able to evaluate, to analyze, to apply, to understand, and to remember. Same thing when we talk about the depth of knowledge. If you don't have strategic thinking, you will not be able to do extended thinking. You will have to have those skills and concepts and the ability to recall and reproduce the concepts, right? So you really have to work on these bottom skills first before you can get to the top echelon of these theories that they propose for both Bloom and Webb. One of the biggest things to keep in mind is the idea of comparing and contrasting Bloom's taxonomy versus Webb's depth of knowledge. So now that we understand the concept of depth of knowledge, let's talk about depth of processing. So when I talk about depth of processing, I always like to think about it in terms of shallow processing versus deeper processing. So when we talk about shallow processing, this is going to be or involve memorizing information just through repetition, highlighting, or rereading, right? So this can lead to some superficial learning or very basic information. So when we think about it in terms of Bloom's taxonomy, just at the recall or remember stage, right? So you're not really understanding anything in depth, you're just doing it at a very shallow level. On the other hand, you could have deep processing. And one of the things when I talk about this depth of processing is think of it as a continuum. So it's not just like shallow processing and deep processing. It is going to be a continuum over time. I'll talk about how it relates to Bloom's taxonomy in just a second, okay? So when we have deep processing, this is going to involve making sense of information by connecting it to what you already know, looking for patterns and exploring the implications of that subject material. When you process something at a deeper level, this is going to create stronger and longer lasting memories than shallow processing. So if we're going to compare it to, say, Bloom's taxonomy or to depth of knowledge, the lowest level is going to be where we have the shallowest processing. So remember, understand. If we're talking about DOK, it's going to be the recon, recognize section down here. Again, keep in mind it's on a continuum. So it's not like you just have remember this side of the things, this side, and then you have create on the other side. It is where you have this flow, this flux, right? So we have remember, then we have understand, we have apply and analyze. We really like to think that apply and analyze is in the middle. On the other hand, create is going to be the deepest type of processing information. Or if we think about DOK, that extended thinking in that case. So the other concepts for DOK, which would be the concepts and skills, and then the strategic thinking would be in the middle here, right? I would say strategic thinking is a little bit more on the deeper processing side. The skills and concepts are a little bit more on the shallow processing side, but they're in the middle someplace, right? So keep in mind when we talk about depth of processing, it's on a continuum. Let me provide you an example of what might it look like in the classroom. So let's say about taking notes in class, right? So if you're processing it very shallowly in class, such as note taking, you might just be writing verbatim what's on the PowerPoint slide. One of the key things that I like to add is I don't have like a lot of information on my slides. I always add to my slides. So if you're just writing down what's on the PowerPoint slide, you're missing out on information that you're hearing that I'm adding to the slide itself. That would be the very shallowest type of processing. On the other hand, a type of medium processing, if you will, would be rephrasing or summarizing your notes into your own words, right? So when we talk about paraphrasing or summarizing, this could be after the fact. When you're studying for an exam, it could be a variety of different components there. But generally, it's rephrasing it. It's not creating something new, adding new examples, etc. It's just rephrasing what you already had or paraphrasing it. On the other hand, the deepest type of processing when we talk about note taking would be like adding those additional examples or reviewing and finding meaningful context for those examples, meaningful segue into your notes so that when you go back and study, that's bringing up memories as well. All right, what I would like you to do after I read this information is I would like you to think and share with me what is an activity that you have processed at a shallow level, and as two separate questions. So there's two questions to this. So the first question would be, what is an activity that you have processed at a shallow level? Explain how and why you do this. And then the second question will be, what is an activity that you have processed at a deeper level? Again, explain how or why. Again, it doesn't have to be the very deepest, and it doesn't have to be the very shallowest depth of processing, but I am trying to get us to think about what are some of those concepts, those topics that you might process more shallowly versus more deeply in this case. So go ahead and pause that video, answer those questions, and then come back. All right, so one of the things that we need to think about are factors for depth of processing. And when we talk about factors for depth of processing, one of the things that we're going to talk about is learning styles. So I'm going to tell you right now, just give me a second. I do not necessarily agree with learning styles, and I'll explain why and talk about the limitations and the strengths of learning styles in just a second. I mention it because it is very common to talk about in educational psychology. So if you ever hear this or think about it in educational psychology, it is often talked about, so that's why I wanted to bring it up. I also want to mention that your book in chapter number 4 goes into depth about other types of learning and thinking styles. But when we talk about learning and thinking styles, keep in mind these are not abilities, but rather preferred ways of using one's ability. And so when we talk about these learning styles, we're going to talk about them in a preferred way of using one ability, not necessarily the best or the worst way. It's just is a preferred way of using one's ability. When we talk about learning styles, I'm going to focus on auditory, kinesthetic, and visual learning, but your book will also go into impulsive and reflective thinking styles, deep and surface. That is very much like the shallow and deep that we just talked about. And it also goes into optimistic and pessimistic thinking styles as well. One of the biggest things that we need to think about when we talk about these thinking and learning styles, before we talk about the differences, etc., is that while it has been very popular in the field, there are some criticisms, and those 3 criticisms that are involved in these styles. 1, generally there's very low reliability of these styles, so it lacks consistency when they are being assessed. It also has low validity, so we see that the tests that are actually used to measure the styles are not necessarily having face validity or even having those other types of validities that we talked about in this class. We can also see that there's a lot of confusions about the definitions of the styles. And so one of the things when we think about all of these styles is that they are preferences, and that these preferences does not necessarily mean that you can only learn one way. That is my biggest, to be honest, one of my biggest pet peeves when we talk about learning styles is thinking it is the only way that I can learn. We'll talk about that when we talk about these different types of learning styles that I have on the screen here, so kinesthetic, auditory, and visual. But again, one of the biggest things when we see for evidence based off research is that matching the instructions to a student's learning style or preference does not improve learning. Now, I am not to say that the concept of thinking and learning styles are not valuable, because I do think they are valuable. However, one of the biggest things I think that we need to understand is that it's not just about a single learning style or that's the only way a child can learn. Really, it's more about the combination of the styles. So with that said, let's talk about the different types of learning styles. All right, we're going to start with kinesthetic learners or kinesthetic learning first. So when we talk about kinesthetic learning, you might also hear this called hands-on learning. And this style is going to involve learning through physical engagement and experience. Next, we're going to talk about auditory learning. So this style involves learning through listening, and auditory learners are often very good listeners. And they'll best learn through verbal monologues like lectures, speeches, music, and even podcasts. The final type that we're going to talk about in depth is going to be visual learners. And this style involves learning through seeing, and the visual learners may find it easier to absorb information when it's presented with graphics, colors, what's on the PowerPoint slide in front of them. There are, of course, other types of learning styles that have been proposed. The other most common one is reading and writing. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of depth with that one, but I did want to mention it because you might have seen it in the literature before. So reading and writing is going to involve learning through reading and writing, and the students who prefer this style might find it easier to learn through text-based materials like books, articles, and written notes. Now that you know the difference between these learning styles, I want you to take a second, and I really want you to think about this for a second, okay? What is a situation in which you would use only one type of learning style? Go ahead and answer that question and come back. When I pose that question to you guys, hopefully, after you did a little bit of thinking yourself, you realize that really there's not a single instance where it is really just a single learning style. Now, I want to back up and say I'm not necessarily talking about someone that is deaf or that is mute. Because if someone's deaf, then they would not be an auditory learner. Although they could do sign language, right? But if they're doing sign language, then that might be closer to the visual learning. But even then, you might still be thinking of what that word is. And so when we think back to our working memory, in our working memory, we actually have 3 different levels or 3 different stages in working memory. We have the phonological loop, we have the visual spatial sketchpad, and then we have the episodic buffer. I'm not going to talk about the episodic buffer, but for the phonological loop, that is the auditory component when we are talking about our working memory, and then the visual spatial sketchpad is that visual component when we talk about working memory. Remember, in the information processing model, we talked about how we are pulling in information from our senses. It goes through attention, goes through sensory memory. You have to encode it into a short-term memory. Working memory is where we're rehearsing, maintaining, that information, we're going to encode it into long-term memory. We retrieve it from long-term memory and put it back into working memory, and we're going to rehearse and maintain it and strengthen those connections, put it back into long-term, etc. Keep in mind when we talk about the information processing model, it is a cycle at the end. It's not just, okay, now it goes into our long-term memory and then that's the end, right? So when we're thinking about these learning styles, really there's not a single instance where there will be just a singular learning style taking place. So for example, in the classroom, usually what I'm doing is I have a PowerPoint, I'm going off the PowerPoint, but I'm walking around the room. You'll also notice that I don't have a whole lot of text on my slides, and so I'm adding to the PowerPoint. So I'm adding that auditorial component to the lecture, to the PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint itself might be the visual component. The listening to what the professor is saying is that auditory component there, right? So really, it is going to be that combination of visual, auditory learner in that case. We can also see where there's going to be that kinesthetic or auditory learning. So let's say you are an athlete, so you know what your body's supposed to do, so you have that kinesthetic training, that muscle memory, but you also have to listen to the instructions of your coach, because they might, let's just do football because I was watching Sunday Night Football yesterday. They were doing a new route, and so you have to pay attention to what the quarterback or to your coach is calling that play. And so you need to also be listening as well as doing that kinesthetic learning in that case. We can also do that for kinesthetic and visual. A lot of the times it might be that we have all three of them occurring at the same time. So let me go back to that example about in the classroom. So we have the PowerPoint slides on the screen. So you see that visually. You have the professor talking or adding to that PowerPoint. So you have that audio component. And then you are also taking notes. Note-taking would be a kinesthetic learning component, right? So if you have all of that combination, you really are using all of them together. So that visual, that auditory, that kinesthetic learning style together. If you can, I'll throw this out here. If you can prove to me that there's only one specific learning style in one specific situation that I cannot argue, I'll give you extra point, but you have to come and tell me about what that situation is. So with that said, that is the different types of learning style. I think one of the reasons why it has caught on so much is because in conjunction to different learning styles, we are also going to talk about one type of intelligent theory. Now, with that said, we'll have an entire lecture later on devoted to different intellectual theories, intellectual tests, etc. So we'll come back to this. But one of the biggest things when we talk about learning styles is, I think it has held on so long because when we talk about Gardner's multiple intelligent theory, it really lines up really nicely with the concepts of learning styles. More specifically, thinking about how different occupations reflect different strengths. And you could see how that could be the case when we talk about learning styles. So let's go into Gardner's multiple intelligence theory. So Gardner proposed 9 different types of intelligences. So when we talk about these 9 different types, we are going to have the naturalistic. So when we talk about naturalistic skills or naturalistic abilities, this is going to be abilities to absorb patterns in nature and to understand natural and human-made systems. So for individuals that are good with understanding nature, has a green thumb, etc., could be a farmer, a botanist, even a landscaper, right? On the other hand, we could also have individuals that are really skilled at spatial. So visualizing the world in 3D dimensions, right? So individuals that might have very good spatial skills might become an architect, an artist, or even a sailor in this case, right? Navigating the stars. We can also see how an individual really good in linguistic, your book will talk about this being the verbal skills, but being good in finding the right words to express meaning. So this could be an author, a journalist, or even a speaker, a public speaker. I'm going to skip intra and interpersonal just because I want to focus on them in just a little bit. I will give you a hint. These are the two that students get the most confused. So the difference between intra and interpersonal. So we'll come back to this. Next, we have the bodily kinesthetic skills. So these are going to be the ability to manipulate objects and be physically active. So what this means would be those individuals that might go on and have a career in surgeons or craft people or even dancers or even athletes, right? We can also see musical skills. So this would be a sensitivity to pitch, to melody, to rhythm, even to tone. So individuals that might have a really high musical skill might go on to be a composer, a musician, even a music therapist. We also have individuals that are very high on logical and mathematical skills. So they would have the ability to carry out mathematical operations, to quantify things, to make hypotheses, and to prove them. So these are going to be individuals that might go on to be a scientist or a researcher, an engineer, even an accountant. So those are 6 out of the 8 that's listed here. We also have another one, but before I get to emotional intelligence, let's talk about the difference between inter and intrapersonal. So intra, so I-N-T-R-A, intrapersonal, would be the ability to understand oneself and to be able to direct one's life. So when we talk about inter, it's about what you feel, what you want, what you are doing. Interpersonal, on the other hand, is the ability to understand and effectively interact with others. So intra is internal, inter is external. So sensing other people's feelings and motives. You'll notice that I said 9 and only 8 of them are listed here. The 9th one is actually emotional intelligence. And when we talk about emotional intelligence is actually the combination of intra and interpersonal intelligence. Your book actually goes on and mentions another one, and he talks about existential intelligence. I'm not going to talk about that one. I'm going to talk about emotional intelligence, but I guess technically if you want to go by what your book says, there's 10 of them. But emotional intelligence is going to be the ability to understand the emotions of yourself and others, show empathy, understand social relationship and cues, and to regulate your own emotions and respond in culturally appropriate ways. So when we are talking about the career paths for intrapersonal and interpersonal, intrapersonal could be like those therapists, those psychologists, etc., right? Or even theologians when we talk about intrapersonal. Interpersonal could be teachers, or even some extent to mental health professions as well. So with that said, I'm going to wrap up today's video about depth of knowledge and how that relates back to a variety of different concepts, from the Bloom's taxonomy to Webb's depth of knowledge to different learning styles to Gardner's multiple intelligence theory, etc. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.